Welcome to State of the World. I'm Sally Lockwood. Today, I'm talking to former MI6 officer Christopher Steele about Russia and its dark arts when it comes to the negotiations over the war in Ukraine. We're seeing these new potential peace proposals and these talks being held in Moscow, Abu Dhabi, Florida. What's really going on, though, behind the scenes? Well, Christopher Steele worked as an agent in Russia for a number of years before running the Moscow desk back at MI6 in London. He understands how Russia operates better than most, and he's going to give us his intelligence and his take on what's really going on behind the scenes and in the negotiating room. Let's get into it. Hi, Chris. How you doing?
Yeah, very well. Lots going on as always.
Lots going on. So nice to see you. Thanks for coming on again. Let's start with the talks in Moscow that took place between the US delegation, namely Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, with Vladimir Putin. They've come to nothing so far at the time of recording, and there have been so many of these meetings now. The one between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Witkoff has been to Russia several times this year. What is going on behind the scenes as you understand it and with the intelligence that you're hearing?
What seems to be going on is that there's a bigger play coming out of Trump's America than just the Ukraine conflict. And that bigger play probably comprises several elements. One is so-called business opportunities in Russia, which would accrue to Trump and his friends in the hydrocarbon sector in America if there were a deal and sanctions were to be lifted. But also, I think, probably being teased by Putin very cleverly is some kind of hint that Russia could join America, as it were, against China. Now, that, if you look at the degree to which China is the master of Russia at the moment, economically and everything else, politically, seems incredibly naive for anybody in America to believe that that could be forthcoming. So I think there's a sort of combination of those things. And if you like, the Ukraine war is an irritant in the way, which if it was settled on whatever terms that the American negotiators could have, would also probably result in Trump getting his much vaunted Nobel Peace Prize. So I think it's what we're seeing is utterly unprecedented, irresponsible and reckless by the Americans, where they're deploying negotiators who frankly haven't got a clue about what Putin and his regime are really like and what Russia's geostrategic and political interests are and how weak actually Russia is as a power now, having suffered over 1 million casualties in Ukraine for very little gain. And actually, the supplicant seems to be the United States, whereas in reality, in real politics, it should be Russia. So it's a very perverse situation and one which is extremely dangerous and very worrying in terms of setting precedent worldwide that an aggressor like Putin's Russia could be effectively rewarded by the Trump administration for what it's done in Ukraine.
So, Chris, you've studied Vladimir Putin for a number of years. You worked as an agent in Moscow, and you ran the Russia desk for MI6 for a number of years in London. You understand the dark
So
arts
it's reported.
so it's reported. You understand the dark arts of how
Yeah.
Putin and Russia operate. Do you think America is being manipulated by Russia in these negotiations?
Absolutely. I think that what's happened is that the experts and the people with experience of dealing with negotiations in Russia in particular have been sidelined. You know, Rubio, I think the Secretary of State, is trying to put his finger on the dial, but it's quite difficult. But it seems to me that CIA and State Department and even the NSC are pretty marginal now in this process. And of course, you can see where it leads. Effectively, what's happening is that we have these spasms where the Trump and his close associates try and vaunt a deal which is incredibly damaging for European Western security interests in Ukraine. They get rowed back because European leaders and others and the Ukrainians are quite reasonably opposed to some of the measures that they're trying to agree to. And then the Russians reject it. But of course, the big obstacle to peace here is not Ukraine, it's Russia, and it's Putin, and it's his legacy. And that's what's not being taken into account. So America is absolutely being played at the highest level at the moment by Putin, who's actually in a very weak position in many ways.
And for someone with your intelligence background, what questions does it raise, Chris, that the likes of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are leading these negotiations?
Well, I think it raises, as I say, the question of competence and experience for sure. But I think beyond that, it raises the question of where America is now positioning itself. Is it positioning itself in a sort of Congress of Vienna position where it has hegemony on the Western Hemisphere and it cedes hegemony in Europe to Russia and in the Far East possibly to China? Is it going to be a country which going forward is an advocate of democracy, human rights and free trade? Or is it going to become a sort of pragmatic power, realpolitik power, a bit like some of the things that Kissinger used to advocate, and drop its kind of moral and values-based foreign policy from the way it operates in the world? And that's where I think we've got a real problem going forward, because I don't think that Trump is unique in this. I think the trend in America, certainly in Congress and elsewhere, is to abandon the sort of values-based foreign policy, or the elements of it, which we've seen since the Second World War. And I think we're in big trouble.
Just how big is this trouble? I mean, the concern is that there will be some sort of deal reached, and then it'll just be a matter of time before Putin invades again. What do you see happening here when it comes to Russia's strategy, Chris?
Well, I think we have to be absolutely upfront about the state of Russia. Russia is a weakened country. Its armed forces have been devastated by fighting a second or third rate power in Ukraine. Its economy is dependent entirely on oil exports. It's never been developed in the last 25 years. And it has an elite, certainly, which is very uncomfortable and very unhappy about the situation on the ground. So, in a sense, what the Americans under Kushner and Witkoff and Trump are doing is, apparently granting Moscow and Putin in particular victories from the jaws of defeat. And that's what's so concerning. But I think at a more profound level, I think we have to wonder whether NATO has a realistic future and whether America's commitments to its democratic allies are worth the paper they're written on.
And how strong is Russia militarily now after 4 years of war? I'm reading reports that they're struggling to recruit fighters now.
Yeah, Russia is weak militarily, in my view, apart from its strategic deterrent, which, if it was ever used, would result in the destruction of Russia. In conventional military terms, Russia is a weak country. It has, of course, learnt, I think, a lot of lessons from the battlefield in Ukraine, and it's battle hardened now in a sense. So is the Ukrainian army, of course, things like drone warfare and new tactics of warfare. But I think that it's still been unable, for example, to launch what's called combined arms operations, where there's close coordination between the different wings of the military. And that has to be a real sort of, it's encouraging in a sense for us in Europe that Russia has been so incompetent on the battlefield. But Russia is still brutal and has very malign intent.
What do you think Russia really wants out of these talks? And do you think they'll get it?
I'm still quite hopeful that they won't get it. I think the problem with Putin is that he's not played his hand very well. He's got this open goal, if you like, of Trump in office, interested in all the business deals, interested in the Arctic and all the rest of it. But he's not modified his demands. And I think there could be two reasons for that. One is that he can't because of the pressures on him and the price that's been paid within the regime in Moscow. Or secondly, because he's so kind of living in this unrealistic bubble where Russia's this great power and, it will realise its objectives and his legacy will be similar to that of Catherine the Great, that he's just not on the same planet as everyone else. And I suspect it's probably a bit of both.
If these talks collapse, what then?
I think the war will go on. There is some risk, I think, for the first time in a while of a Russian breakthrough in the Donbass, particularly from what I'm seeing and hearing. That needs to be addressed by certainly NATO and the European powers to make sure that Ukraine has the ability to prevent that happening. The Russian economy is probably the most important factor here, plus China. I mean, those are the things I think that have always been key to understanding this conflict and why it's carried on as long as it has. Putin apparently is very worried by the fact that this conflict with Ukraine has been going on almost as long now as the Second World War did for Russia, the 4 years or whatever it was, just under. And that given what he's got to show for it compared with what the Red Army had to show for it after 4 years, that is a very unflattering historical legacy in comparison. And I think it's the sort of thing that we should be playing up in the West, just how failed this operation has been.
And as a former MI6 officer who worked for a long time in and on Russia, and who has subsequently studied Donald Trump in great detail, what are you looking at now in terms of how this could play out between America, Russia, and Ukraine, and what concerns you?
Well, what concerns me is what's always concerned me, which is Donald Trump's personality, where a narcissistic personality disorder is clearly a very significant issue of interest to a hostile intelligence service or hostile state. And, Putin is effectively operating as like a case officer here. All the theatrics, when he dealt with Angela Merkel, he was clear that she was afraid of dogs, so he deployed his dog in a meeting, things like this. And in terms of keeping people waiting,
I did not know that. Sorry, I'm just going to stop you there. What? Putin deployed his dog in a meeting with Angela Merkel because she had a phobia of dogs. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Go and look it up.
Oh my God. That is extraordinary.
Yeah, well, it's his leitmotif.
So what would he deploy against Trump then? I mean, what do you think he could have done in Alaska?
I mean, clearly, the theatrics of the meeting in Moscow was that it was Putin that kept the Americans waiting, and they were prepared to accept that kind of subservient and humiliating stance, which I would never have accepted. Somebody said he wouldn't keep Xi Jinping waiting, so why should he keep the Americans waiting? So he's turning the sort of psychological tables on them, making them look as though they're supplicants, making them look as though they're useful idiots. And he had no intention, in my opinion, of agreeing to the new plan that had been devised, where the 28 points had been reduced to 19 or whatever it was as a result of European and Ukrainian pressure, because what Russia really wanted had been taken out of the proposed agreement.
So who's more powerful here in these talks, Russia or America? What does that tell you when Vladimir Putin keeps the American delegation waiting?
Well, America should clearly have the whip hand and be the most powerful and be the demandeur. And the theatrics and the looks of it are that it's the opposite. And that's what's so concerning about just how amateurish and arguably corrupt what's going on actually is.
Chris, thank you so much. It's always so interesting to get your take on the inner workings of Putin and Russia. If you found this interesting, you can see part 2 of my interview with Christopher Steele later in the week, where we get into Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, the potential connection there with Russia, and what he makes of the latest evidence that's emerged in terms of photographs and emails. He's been looking at these individuals for a really long time, and he's got some really interesting conclusions. Hit subscribe if you don't already, and you'll see when the episode goes live. Thanks for watching.